Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 309 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. In this episode, I'm delighted to catch up with Amy Peters, who is a lead counsellor and founder of Newgate Counselling, a neurodivergent therapy service. She's professionally accredited member of the National Counselling and Psychotherapeutic Society, Level 4 Diploma in Counselling, has a QLS Level 6 Child Counselling Certificate, and has undertaken Rewind therapy training for post-traumatic stress and trauma. And today, Amy is going to talk about a lecture she has delivered for the Counsellor CPD Library called Exploring Neurodivergence Creatively. So with that said, let's get on with today's episode.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and a warm welcome. This is episode 309 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Rory and I are absolutely delighted that you've joined us for our 3 topics: ethical, sustainable practice, where we're going to be looking at online trauma therapy, the effective strategies for counsellors. We then go into our practice matters, where today Rory will be speaking with Amy Peters on exploring neurodivergence creatively. And then we end today's session always with our student services, where we see you, our students, and we're going to be speaking about along the lines of what you need to know about protecting yourself from having vicarious trauma during your counselling studies. We'll be telling you what that is, what it looks like, how it shows itself, and what you can do. So welcome everybody. And Rory, the first topic, ethical, sustainable practice, talking about that online trauma therapy, the effective strategies for counsellors.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think it's good just to set a little bit of the background here. Online counselling has now become a standard offering within the counselling portfolio, whether you work as a private practitioner or you work as a student, student counsellor, or you're employed. You might work for a healthcare provider, or you might work for an organisation that offers counselling, a charity, or even the NHS. These are becoming standard offerings. And I think the first thing I would say, before we even get into the trauma piece, is that anybody who works online should do some form of training around working online. And the reason for that is there are psychological actions or psychological processes that appear online that don't appear in the therapy room. So the first thing is make absolutely sure that you've done some form of training course in online and telephone counselling. I think straight off the bat, one of the psychological processes that is really, really present is disinhibition effect. What's that? Well, it was a psychological theory developed by an American psychologist called John Suler, and it actually found its origins in online gaming and people becoming disinhibited online. And now we see that in quite a few areas of online activity, such as posting on social media posts where people say things they wouldn't usually say or act in ways they wouldn't usually act online that they wouldn't do face to face. We have to be very thoughtful of the disinhibition effect, because it can affect not only ourselves as therapists, but also our clients. So we have to have a good understanding of the theory, but also a good understanding of how that might present in the online therapy space.
Yes, Rory. And, you're speaking about disinhibition effect. If you want to delve a little bit deeper into that, we'll pop a link in the show notes, because did a whole podcast where we really dived into that disinhibition effect. But I just want to echo what you said, Rory, around the importance of training and undertaking a dedicated online and telephone counselling course. And this is not just us that think this. If you look to your ethical body, no matter where you are in the world, I'm almost willing to bet that they're going to have suggestions that you do not work online until you've done adequate training in that. And certainly here in the United Kingdom, there is even a framework that governs how we work and interact online. And the British Association of Counselling Psychotherapists, BACP, have a curriculum of what should be covered to give you the competencies you need to work online. We built a course for online working, online and telephone working. It's a certificate in online and telephone working. You built that, Rory, and we built that because there is this need to do this training, and there is maybe the thought that you take what you do in a face-to-face setting that you learnt when you were doing your formal training and apply that online, and there are areas that can trip you up and end up potentially not serving our clients to the point that it can be damaging in the relationship. And if we don't know, well, you don't know what you don't know. And that's why that training is so important. If you're interested in that, go to counsellingtutor.com. You can have a look at our certificate training. We've made it really low cost so that it is accessible to all, because there's a great need and more people are turning to online. Rory, you mentioned John Sula, his disinhibition effect. I can't say it, but I can definitely. I know what it is, though. And how that shows itself online. And one of the thoughts I have on that is, you see it in online dating apps. I've never used them. I'm very glad to say, not of the ilk of the online dating app users, but you swipe left if you think the person's not for you, and right if you think they are. I don't know if I've got that right, so no letters, please. It might be the other way around. I don't know. But I wonder if you'd be able to do that in person. Would you be able to swipe someone left or say, no, not you, maybe you, not you? We wouldn't do that in person. And that just shows how our activity online, when there's that feeling of an anonymity, changes how we act and behave. And it changes how your client acts and behaves and how they will show up. Understanding that in depth, how it shows itself and what you can do to kind of work with that, so much important. Now, we're speaking about the topic of online trauma therapy, and we need to understand these kind of the psychology behind it first, and that's why we're laying this groundwork. And the next one is the black hole effect, also from John Schuler, where he speaks about in a face-to-face setting, I'm in the same room as you, when we come to the end of a session, you're going to stand up and you're going to leave and you're going to go away, and that is expected. And if you're angry in the session as a client and you don't want to be there anymore, then you've got to say, well, I'm leaving now, and you're going to stand up and walk out and storm out. But at least I know what happened as the therapist. Black hole effect is what happens if the client disappears, just gone. Because think about it, online, being in the room and not being in the room is the click of a mouse, and it happens within a second. What happens if the client goes away? Where does that leave you feeling? What have I done? It may have been their internet. It may have been their choice. We don't know. What happens if the client's counselor suddenly disappears? I'm having bad internet this morning, Rory, as we're making this recording. I might disappear at any time, but we have an agreement in place of what happens if that does happen. I'm going to get back in touch with you. We're going to get back together and continue this podcast. So the black hole effect is recognizing that it can abruptly end. It can leave you and the client with a lot of feelings around that that are unresolved, because when the person's gone, they're gone. and what is the plan around that? So these are the kind of foundations. And of course, we wouldn't be able to lay the foundations without speaking, Rory, about fantasy attachment as well.
Yes, it's an interesting idea, fantasy attachment, and I think it possibly points towards those who work on the phone, because you can only hear a voice at the other end of the telephone. And sometimes what can happen is that clients can build a fantasy of who you are, and there may be some transference in that. They may think of you as someone that they've met in their past, and they can fantasize about who you are and also about what their relationship with you is. You know, a fantasy is just that, isn't it? Where you think of all sorts of aspects of a relationship, not just the counselling relationship. It could be someone fantasizing about having a different form of relationship with you. And I think that fantasy attachment, black hole, disinhibition are all underpinnings of what can happen if someone becomes traumatized. Because if you have a traumatized client, these are things that need very, very careful managing, because with traumatized people, it doesn't take very much to push them into deeper trauma or disassociation. So it's so essential that anybody who works online, along with the risk management plan, which we'll talk about, has an understanding of if the relationship is starting to drift, because we know, the research tells us, that the therapeutic relationship is one of the main ingredients in positive outcomes for therapy. And if we can manage things like fantasy attachment, black hole effects, disinhibition effects, we'll be in a better position to be able to build that therapeutic relationship. And in terms of fantasy attachment, I think a good observation here is make sure you have a picture of yourself on your listing or your website, so the client actually knows who you are. You know, I think that's just really important, so they can put a face to the voice. If you're working on the phone, may not always be achievable if you're working for an organization, but this disconnect that can happen with fantasy can really leak in to disassociation, and before you know it, you might have a disassociated client on the other end of the phone or the other end of the video cam.
100%, Rory. And when you're speaking about that phenomena, fantasy attachment, I'm reminded of my own life, where I would listen to the radio a lot. When I was driving, I would always listen to the drive time. And then one day I came upon a picture of the DJ that I'd been listening to probably for years. And I said, he doesn't look like he sounds. There it is. It is. That's fantasy attachment, because I'd made a picture of what this person is. And I wonder how many people might be listening to this that have maybe listened to the Counselling Tutor podcast for some time that have never seen either Rory or myself. I wonder if you went to counsellingtutor.com, click on our About page, we've got our pictures there. Have a look. Do we look like we sound? Or maybe you do know us. You know, that makes it a little bit different. But like you say, Rory, having who you are and what you look like, specifically if working on phone or via text or email, really, really important. So the person has the reality and at least an anchor of who you might be. And then, of course, risk management. This is crucial. It's crucial to develop a robust risk management plan, which includes gathering comprehensive client information, having clear emergency procedures. We're talking about trauma here. Trauma is really, really important. And what we don't want to be doing is, within the moment where we might see that there's massive distress within the room, trying to work out what we're going to do. We do the planning beforehand. And I think this is an area that we can speak about just for a moment, Rory, because I think this is vital. You would, of course, get your client information when working online, but you're also going to get your client's location. Now, if somebody is coming to you face-to-face in the room and sitting down, it may be you have no need to have their home address for any reason. But when you're working online, you need the client's location. You need to have emergency contacts of people other than the client that you can contact. And that, again, you might not ask for that kind of information in a face-to-face setting. And of course, your risk management plan is also going to look at your emergency procedures. Can you tell us, Rory, why is it important that we have client information, their location, and emergency contacts?
Well, first of all, if you're in a therapy room and someone becomes unwell, physically unwell, so say someone has an epileptic fit, or someone has a heart attack, or someone just becomes really, really unwell, what one would do, certainly here in the UK, is we'd dial 999 and we'd ask for an ambulance and medical assistance. And we would have a singular location, our practice room. Come to Rory's practice room, 47 The High Street, Manchester, and the ambulance will be able to go there. But if you're working online with someone and all of a sudden they become ill, unwell, they fall over, and you haven't got their details, who are you going to send them to? You could call 999 and say, well, my client's I think my client's having a heart attack. Well, where are they? Well, I don't know. I'm working online. And that is the main reason we have those details, so that should anything happen, as we always say, we hope for the best, but plan for the worst. That's always the rule in risk. And we're able to get the assistance they need. Now, it may never happen in practice, but it only has to happen once. So that is the reason that we get their name and address details. And also we get an emergency contact for the same reason, preferably someone who knows they're having therapy. So, it may be that they confide in someone and saying, I'm seeing a therapist. Maybe that person, a best friend or a family member, so that we're able to call them and gain assistance, because it may be that if someone's in the same house, they can render assistance quickly. And it's something you don't even think about, I don't think, when you work in the room face to face. You never think of having someone's name and address, although it is good practice to take comprehensive details, I have to say. But purely for that piece, you're online, you're on the phone, the client becomes unwell, they need medical attention, you have their details, you can guide the medical services to their location and hopefully get the support they need. Something that is taught in all online and telephone counselling courses, and I think we do labour the point in ours, Ken.
We do. I think you might be right there, Rory.
I think it might be right.
But we only belabor it because it is so important. And this brings us on to our next point, which is utilising mental health questionnaires. I'm going to hand this over to you, Rory. This is an important topic. Why is this important? Now, we're talking here about you being a therapist and maybe being happy to work with trauma online. Why would we need these mental health questionnaires, and how do they serve the client, Rory? Are they not just for collecting data and reporting?
Well, I think a lot of people think that, CORE or PHQ-9 are really for reporting and stats, and they're done in organisations to be able to justify funding. But actually, they have a very serious and necessary function. So if we take Core 10, which is one of the more popular forms of assessment, it's basically a scoring grid where you ask a number of very well thought out questions, and depending on the answers, you can score that. And it may be that there's an underlining issue. Remember, not all clients tell you what's going on for them. Some clients may not want to voice what's going on. But by using the questionnaire and using the scores from it, you could look at it and you can say, well, it looks to me like, from what you've said and your responses, that you're slightly depressed at the moment, slightly anxious. And it might be the client goes, yes, that's exactly it. So that's very useful, and also kind of useful to use through the arc of therapy to see where the client is. You can use the questionnaire again, and it may be as they're getting through the arc of therapy, they find that things get better. It's an evidence base for the client to see that they've answered questions, and actually the questions that they've been asked to answer are showing them they're feeling better. It kind of reinforces the therapy. Now, when we get into things like PHQ-9, and I want people to really listen to this. Sound like an ex-tutor now, don't I? Is that there's a risk assessment for suicidal ideation in that, and we can no longer have low, medium, and high risk for suicide. It may be when we do the questionnaire, it comes out like that, but we have to continually assess. There's been a huge change in the assessment of suicidal ideation, and that's been driven by the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which is a UK-based organisation that quality standards not only medication but also risk assessment. So just because someone is referred to and they've got a very low risk of suicidal ideation, it's up to you to assess it within the relationship, not to dogmatically rely on a assessment that's been done by somebody else. Really, really important. But it does give us, again, PHQ-9, much the same thing, but it does give us a baseline to work on. So should the client become unwell, or should the client say they're going to take their own life, we can make a decision about that, and maybe we have to refer, or maybe have to break confidentiality if that is in your contract, and that's another story, how we put that in your contract so that we can support them, because sometimes when people are feeling very low, they may not make the best decisions, and sometimes with a bit of extra help and another few days, they may have been glad that someone intervened and kind of helped them gain a bit of time to make a better decision whether they should or shouldn't take their lives, Ken.
Wow. Yeah, it's such a consideration, isn't it? And I guess working with trauma online demands a heightened awareness of unique psychological effects and the implementation of those rigorous safety protocols. And I think that by understanding phenomena such as the disinhibition effect and fantasy attachment and developing the comprehensive risk management plans, therapists just go on to provide a safe and effective online therapy for those seeking. And Rory has put together a handout on this topic. Not only a handout, we've also developed a full in-depth article on this, and you'll be able to get the handout that covers everything we've spoken about today. It's got some references and further readings to that as well. And if you're looking for that, go to counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab, go to episode 309, that's 309, and everything is there on that page. And of course, if you're listening to this and thinking, you know what, maybe it's time for me to look at online and telephone counselling training, and you want to look at our certification course, low cost, really in-depth, comprehensive course, and you'll find that at counsellingtutor.com. Just go there. All our courses are available. And that is the end of our ethical, sustainable practice for today. And I guess as we back out of ethical, sustainable practice, it's into practice matters. This is the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor podcast, where we bring experts in their areas. And Rory, you spoke with Amy Peters on a topic that I think is so vitally important. In fact, so important, we're building a training course on this very topic. It's neurodivergence, but we're really niching down on this. And Amy Peters speaking about exploring neurodivergence creatively.
Yeah, absolutely. Amy's been with us on the podcast before. She's a neurodivergent therapist. She's an autistic therapist, and she runs an organisation that supports autistic or neurodivergent clients. And by neurodivergent, we mean people with autism, people with ADHD, people who may be dyslexic. There's quite a big umbrella of neurodivergence, and I guess it's becoming an emerging identity for people, because until it was given a name and people came together to explore it, it was such a different there's different presentations that people didn't really know why they felt so different. And now we know that not everybody's brain is I guess wired up in the same way. We have a kind of difference in the way we're wired up, and with that, we can bring different things to our lives. So I spoke with Amy Peters, who is very, very knowledgeable about how we explore the work with neurodivergent clients in a creative way. And this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
So neurodivergence seems to be the topic of conversation for most therapists now. It's an emerging group of people who probably have remained hidden for a number of years, and now we're getting a better understanding of neurodivergence, be that ADHD or autism, all the other neurodivergent presentations under the umbrella of, I guess, neurodivergence. So I'm really, really pleased to have back again Amy Peters, who's done a fantastic lecture on exploring neurodivergence creatively. So Amy, welcome back again.
Hello, Rory. Thanks for having me back.
So can you briefly explain what neurodivergence is and why exploring it creatively is important?
Absolutely. So neurodivergence is really a non-medical term, and it's for someone who has a brain that works differently from, let's say, the typical brain. And as you said in your intro, it encompasses a broad range of experiences. So autism and ADHD would be examples, but as would Tourette's, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and also things like PTSD and epilepsy would be under there too. So it's really anyone who perceives the world in a different way to that which is seen as the kind of expected norm or typical way could be seen as neurodivergent. And I think the importance of exploring neurodivergence creatively, particularly in our work as counsellors, there's often this stereotype, I think, that neurodivergent people, particularly autistic people actually, aren't very creative or perhaps have very kind of fixed mindsets. And I think, yes, although there are some truth to that in terms of the rigid thinking, I'm certainly someone that can very much have that kind of black and white thinking. It isn't true that we're not creative at all. And many neurodivergent people can think outside the box, have brilliant creative minds, have lots of ideas, can be really, really visual. And I think so as counsellors, we can really collaborate with clients to utilise that kind of creativity in our work with them. And then on top of that, I think some neurodivergent people might struggle to communicate verbally too. So within therapy, that could be very difficult. So when we use creative methods, I think it can help the client to communicate to us in a different way and helps us to learn as a therapist more about our client too.
Absolutely. So meeting the client where they're at, which is always where we should be as therapists, trying to meet the client where they're at and trying to see the world through their frame of reference. I wonder what inspired you to focus on neurodivergence in your practice. I think you might have touched on this, but what was it that kind of made you focus on thinking, I will produce a lecture on neurodivergence and supporting those who are neurodivergent?
I think, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, my children were diagnosed as various different types of neurodivergence, and I kind of uncovered that for myself at the same time. And alongside that, within my practice, neurodivergent clients just seemed to arrive. And I think I felt a real affinity with them, and they also seemed to resonate with my approach. So it really made sense, I think, to work with neurodivergent clients. And I think in terms of the lecture, as I worked with neurodivergence more and more and started to focus on that more and more, I realised that there were still so many stereotypes around autistic and ADHD clients specifically. They tend to be the people that I'm working with. And I really wanted to challenge that within the lecture and allow space for some more creative work for counsellors. And I think also for late diagnosed or late identified neurodivergent people like me, I think we can sometimes find it hard to explore that newfound neurodivergence just with talking and just with words. And there's likely a lot that's been suppressed for us over the years as well. So being creative, I think, really helps with that.
Yeah, so, methods like art, music and writing, are those useful ways of kind of helping someone explore their neurodivergent experiences?
Absolutely. And I think what they do, those creative methods bring the unconscious forward and really can help a client with their self-awareness. And obviously within therapy, that's really key. I think also there can be communication differences between a therapist and a client sometimes. So whether that's a neurotypical therapist and a neurodivergent client, but equally, even if we're both neurodivergent, there's likely to be some communication differences. And so that art, that music, games can kind of transcend that, I think. And I don't think it's just art and music and games and so on, as I was saying. So I created some therapy cards a couple of years ago, and they're called Neuro cards, and they were around a way to explore neurodivergent traits in a really kind of non-pathologizing way. And there weren't many tools around, I think, for neurodivergence. So I just wanted to create something tangible for clients to be able to literally hold and kind of explore those traits. And I think that's what creativity does. It kind of makes tangible something which is otherwise intangible, and being able to see that which is inside the person and actually being able to externalize it in front of us, I think, which is just so helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you were to think about maybe a vignette of clients you've worked with, could you give us, an example, obviously without breaking confidentiality, of how your creative approaches have significantly helped neurodivergent people?
Yes, so I think one of the most interesting things is being able to use the client's passions and interests within the therapy room. And as we know, a lot of neurodivergent people have great intense passions and sometimes called special interests or maybe hyperfixations. And actually, it's a great way to engage clients within therapy. So something I found really useful is a lot of my clients have a passion or an interest for Minecraft, the PC game. That's like a sandbox computer game where you can build and create worlds within this computer game. And I've had clients before who really resonated with that, really been interested in this game. And what we've been able to do is take a concept, for instance, maybe we create a safe space for them within their Minecraft world, and they can use their knowledge of that game to create this world, to be able to walk me through it, and actually gives like great insightful conversation, I think, around that. And it allows them to explore things within a game which already feels safe to them, for that example. And I also think using those passions and interests, what we can see is that those hyperfixations, focuses, special interests can be so regulating for a lot of neurodivergent people. So in this case, you can help a client to feel regulated within a session by using those passions and interests.
Absolutely. And I think that that is such an important thing for anybody who's working with a neurodivergent client group. I mean, I think it's, at this point I have to acknowledge that the term neurodivergent does carry a little bit of controversy within the neurodivergent or autistic community. Some people would prefer not to have that term. I've had a couple of people contact me saying that they find the term not helpful, but it seems to be the standardised language now within therapy. So, in terms of working specifically with neurodivergent clients, what kind of common challenges would you see presenting in your therapy room, and how can creativity address those challenges?
I think we've mentioned communication already, and communication challenges for neurodivergent people can often be worked with creatively. We can work with that in different ways. I think masking is a big one that we might see within the therapy room, but also we might be able to help the client work with how they mask in their everyday life. So masking is really us hiding our neurodivergent self in order to fit into what is essentially a neurotypical world. And so if we take, say, a late diagnosed adult like myself, like maybe we've masked for years and years, so there's a lot of suppression, there's a lot of things to be uncovered there. And I think learning about yourself in therapy as a client, you can use those creative ways to externalize something that's been suppressed for so long and hidden from the self. So something I like to do is use the sand tray a lot. So I might use the sand tray with pebbles or with characters, for example, and you can look at masking within that sand tray. So maybe what are the client's feelings around the mask, what's behind the mask, what are their feelings towards the mask. All of those kind of things can be really helpful. Or we might use nesting dolls or something to look at the layers of masking that someone has, or perhaps some artwork or Play-Doh. Make a Play-Doh model of the mask, for example. So that, like, just one example of how you can take something which actually is difficult for someone who's neurodivergent and actually be able to work with it creatively to give them more insights and increase that self-awareness again.
Yeah, did I hear you say nesting goals? Did I hear you say that, or was it another word?
Nesting dolls, like Russian dolls, like nesting dolls. The ones that fit inside.
Yes, it's my hearing. I thought you said gold nesting dolls, Russian dolls. Very, very interesting. Yeah, trying to get what's outwardly presented to the world, and also that internal feeling. As you say, the mask, I think, is an interesting metaphor for how some people in the neurodivergent community interact. So, if we're thinking of working with neurodivergent clients, how do we ensure that the environment, our therapy rooms, are inclusive and the activities are inclusive? And also, how do we address the challenges that neurodivergent clients may face on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think mostly it's about creating emotional safety, as we would do for all our clients anyway. But for neurodivergent people, we often might have a fear of being perceived, possibly. We might be quite sensitive to rejection. So presented with a kind of creative task within therapy could be quite anxiety inducing. It might be that client feels they're expected to perform or mask even more, potentially. So I think being collaborative is so, so important. It's checking in with that client for how they feel about this creative task. It's us being able to be flexible, to be able to be open to change. And I think reviewing with the client and checking in with things like sensory considerations. So I mentioned sand tray earlier, but actually checking in with that client, what's it like to work with sand for you? Is the texture okay for you? Do we need to adapt this? Can we just use the tabletop instead of the sand? Those kind of things. We might be thinking about other adaptations that we need to make within therapy rooms. So it might be lighting changes. It might be using fidget toys, or perhaps having flexible seating options and things like that. Just really, as I said, collaborating with the client to make sure that emotional safety is there for them.
Absolutely. And one of the things we do know, and that research has provided us with, is that neurodivergent individuals sometimes have co-occurring mental health issues like anxiety or depression. So how does engaging in this creative work impact on the mental health and well-being of neurodivergent individuals?
I think for anyone, it can be quite hard to put thoughts or feelings down into words, whether that's written words or whether we're speaking to someone about it. And I think creative activities allow us to get some of this out in different ways. For neurodivergent people, some of us might have alexithymia, which is like the difficulty in identifying and naming emotions. And we might also have a difficulty with our sense of our interoceptive sense. So our sense of what's going on in our body, for example. And that can make it that much more difficult to think about our emotions, to explore them, to be able to ask for what we need and identify our needs. So I think if we can use creative methods as counsellors to help those clients express that emotion, then we can really improve their connection to self. I think that's a really important thing. And also, I think it can just be an outlet for when we're overstimulated, we're overwhelmed, maybe with the sensory experience going on. Creative things can be a really grounding experience and a bit of relief and a bit of time out, I think, from racing thoughts, from anxiety, from whatever else is going on in that day-to-day life, and can really help with being able to regulate yourself emotionally, I think.
Absolutely. And finally, what do you hope that those who watch your lecture may take away from it?
I really hope that people that watch the lecture will maybe challenge a few of the stereotypes that they might hold around neurodivergent clients. but also really that they will be able to take away some practical tools to work with their own neurodivergent clients, and ultimately just feel much more confident about working creatively with this client group, because it can be such a rewarding experience, I think, for both parties.
Absolutely. Exploring neurodivergence creatively is in the Counselling Tutor CPD library. It's available to watch. And it just remains for me to say, Amy Peters, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to you, Rory, for holding the important conversations, and of course for our repeat guest, Amy Peters, exploring neurodivergence creatively. We now move on to Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting, and it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. Today in Student Services, we're going to be following up on our last episode. We're going to be speaking about vicarious trauma, what that is, where you might see that during your counselling studies. And this is a big call out and reminder. Anybody that is listening to this podcast or watching this podcast in real time, then the actual live lecture, which is free to attend for all students, is available tomorrow. Now, if you're listening in the future and you've missed it, it's okay. You can still use the same link I'm going to share with you now, and you'll be able to watch the replay. And the link is counselingtutor.com/live. That's LIVE live. That's going to take you to the lecture that Rory is delivering live on trauma, what a counselling student needs to know. And Rory, what is vicarious trauma, and why, as a counselling student, do we need to know this?
Well, very, very straightforwardly put, vicarious trauma is trauma that a helper can experience when listening to or working with clients who are traumatized. So in every walk of life, in certainly in professional services, in emergency services, they'll be going to very traumatic incidents where people maybe hurt or unwell, or, bomb incidents or plane crashes. I don't want to trigger anybody listening to the podcast. But also, just generally, if you're a therapist, you hear some very difficult stories that people tell of their lives. And what can happen is those stories can stick with you and traumatize you. It's a form of secondary trauma, vicarious by association, I think is probably the best way to describe it. Trauma by association. And it's quite interesting. When I did my research as a student, as an undergraduate, I did it on post-traumatic stress, and I studied the incident in Bhopal in India, the Union Carbide factory. It was a battery factory that had a terrible fire and explosion. And it did two things. First of all, it identified that anybody can get post-traumatic stress. And also there was a lot of vicarious trauma. So families of those affected, people in the area who weren't even involved in the explosion, they became traumatized. So trauma by association. And in terms of the student experience, even as students in skills practice, you may hear someone who talks about something that's very, very difficult, and you might find yourself, not being able to get to sleep, maybe imagining what's happened to this person, and maybe being a bit fearful, that this could happen to you. And that, Ken, would be vicarious trauma, and it can happen at any stage of training.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon. So it's it kind of transfers itself from one to another. And what's interesting with vicarious trauma, it doesn't have to be a person-to-person interaction. You can experience vicarious trauma from watching the news and what you're left with and how that feels to you. And it may well trigger something that might have happened to you or nearly happened to you, or may have happened to a family member or somebody that you know. And suddenly it takes you out of the present moment of being in that simulated skills session, if you're at college maybe, and somebody mentions something, and you're somewhere else for a brief moment, and maybe experiencing emotions inwardly that are not yours. That it's vicariously brought up by what's been spoken about. And as we spoke in our last episode, and of course you can go and listen to that, it's 308, just go to Counselling Tutor, click on the podcast, and you can listen to it. We were speaking about how trauma is not always some incredibly tragic event that has happened. It could be something that nearly happened, or something that you imagined might happen in your own life, and then somebody else mentioning something many years later can trigger that. And I'm going to give you an example of this now. So we're going to say we're in a triad now. There's 3 people. We're broken up in our skills practice group, and our job is to work together and to do 15 minutes each, one person watching, one being the speaker, one being the listener, and to swap around. Well, maybe somebody speaks about something really low level. As the speaker, I might speak about my trip in to the university today, and how I was driving and how it was really busy, and how I got quite angry because somebody cut me off. They cut in front of me. Well, it may well be that the person that is the observer, not even the listener, might have had an incident within their life where they were in a car accident, and it can bring it back right there and then. It's kind of, they're transported back to that moment, and they can become experience vicarious trauma through that. So it's not necessarily a really heavy topic that has to be brought. It can be anything, really. It's amazing how our neurons in our brain work. We hear one thing and it kind of fires off a series of neurons, and it links to a memory or something that we heard once or experienced once, and we can be vicariously traumatized through that. And of course, we can see that in the clients. If you are maybe in placement practice and you're seeing clients, they can be vicariously traumatized by what's going on in their family, to their family members. They may even be bringing that to counseling with their troubles with what is happening to someone else, maybe a friend or something like that. So understanding what it is, I think, is a very good starting point. And of course, we want to watch out for ourselves as the carers, and including while we're studying, that we don't experience that ourselves, or if we recognize that might be playing out in somebody else in our skills group, or personal development group, or just a classroom discussion. It can show itself in so many ways that we're maybe able to identify that and label it as vicarious trauma. We wouldn't say that out loud, but to identify it. And then what might we do, Rory? So if it was myself and I'm the observer in this triad, and somebody speaks about being cut off and being angry on the way to work, and I'm now taken back to a time where maybe I was in an accident and I'm feeling that, what might we do?
Well, I mean, I think if the listener, the person who's doing the listening, starts to get unwell or agitated or maybe tearful, I've seen that happen. I've seen that people have been listening to someone's story and all of a sudden they become very tearful, and they look like they're actually there. I think we've all witnessed a person who's talking about something, and you can see that they're literally there. They're experiencing it as if they were there. And the same thing can happen with someone who's listening. That's the vicarious element. And what you can do is remind that person that they're safe. That's the first thing. Because when people start to go into a cycle of trauma, what usually happens is they're transported into the past. Now, in case of vicarious trauma, it's a imagination of what's happened. So they're not experienced it themselves, maybe, or they may experience something like that, but almost certainly they'll be catapulted into the past. So it's really essential to try and bring the person into the here and now. And you can do that a number of ways. Just have a bit of a chat and say, are you okay? You look a little bit disconnected. Do you know where you are? I mean, it might sound a very strange thing to ask, but sometimes just asking that question engages the top of the brain, and will bring that person back into the here and now. And of course, if someone is quite unwell with it, there's a couple of things you could do. You could ask them to look at an object in a room, explain what the object looks like, what it sounds like. You can point to a chair and say, tell me about that chair. Tell me what would happen in that chair. So you're taking people out of the past. And also you could do something call it square breathing, where you ask the person to inhale, count to 4, exhale, count to 4, inhale, count to 4, exhale, count to 4. And that steadies the nervous system. It kind of arrests the body going into a traumatic cycle. And of course, if you are a student, get the assistance of the tutor if someone is really unwell. Sometimes just asking someone to go for a walk down the corridor can do it, because they're engaging other parts of the body. So one of the things I'd used in my therapy room was if a client was struggling, I'd get them to tap their hands maybe, or stamp the feet, so that, again, that top brain starts to work and starts to lift them out of the part of the brain where the trauma is. Or you could do something called a butterfly hug. You cross your arms, I'm doing this now, and put your palms onto your chest and just kind of tap your body. You can hear me tapping on the mic. I can hear that. And again, what happens is it arrests the physiological parts of the body that go into trauma. It kind of just settles them and quietens them down. I would say that if someone is in that situation, then maybe there's stuff that's gone on in their past that maybe they could do with and looking at, or being supported in therapy. But those are just some of the things. But I don't know about you, Ken, but certainly in skills practice, I've seen people, literally go grey when they've been listening to someone's story, and I've had to step in and say, okay, I think just take a bit of a break here. Focus on the person who's struggling. What do you need? And in one case, the person sat for about a third of the lesson in the canteen, just with a cup of coffee in the refectory, just to bring themselves down a bit. It does happen, and we have to protect ourselves. And I guess if we're in a teaching situation, our peers, if we can recognise it, we can help.
Yeah, nicely said, Rory. And so you spoke there about square breathing, butterfly hug, describing something in the room. These are all grounding techniques, and they are covered in detail in episode 308, last week's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. You can find that on the counsellingtutor.com website or on your favourite podcast app. But you now understand vicarious trauma, what to look out for, what it might feel like if that starts playing out in yourself. And I want to clarify, when I was speaking, it can kick off things that you may have experienced or someone else may have experienced, but it can also just come out of nowhere. It can be their story and you have no reference or experience of that at all. And like you said, Rory, you're imagining yourself into that, or what it might have been like that for that person, like watching a news or listening to the news and thinking about those poor people and how that must have been for them, and then experiencing trauma within yourself. You have those grounding techniques, and as Rory quite rightly said there, break that session, because in real therapy, out there, you're a qualified therapist working with a client. If that client becomes traumatized, you don't carry on saying, "Oh, I see that you are looking rather traumatized there." You're going to break that. You're going to check if they're okay. You're going to maybe step out of your modality and your main model. So the same within your training environment. If that is playing out, it's okay to just stop and check that person is okay and what they need. Because at the end of the day, we're there for the best service of the clients. And if it's you, say, you know what, I can't go on anymore. This is what's playing out in me. And then speak to your tutor or work with a grounding technique or or something like that. I think it's really important to recognize it, not to hide it, not to, oh, this is silly, I shouldn't really feel like this. You are feeling like that, or they are feeling like that. And we respect those feelings and work with them as best we can. And,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we don't want to go too deep into working with trauma in this section, because it really is student services. It's for you, our students, and the truth is, trauma is a specialist training, and as we said in last week's episode, not always taught at any great level within counselling training. We do have a trauma-informed practice certificate and trauma-informed practice course. It is for qualified therapists, so if you're kind of getting to graduation, you might want to look that out. And Rory, what is the stance on the trauma-informed training course, maybe for a student that might be in placement? Is it appropriate, or should they wait until they have their certificate before undertaking that next level of training?
Well, I've got two thoughts there. And the first thought, just to link to what you said earlier, Ken, is about empathy. So, when we work with clients, we work in an empathic way, work in their frame of reference. But as we always used to say in my training groups, try and put yourself in someone else's shoes, but leave your socks on, and leave enough of yourself to be able to come back from the client's story and reintegrate with self. That's really, really important. Now, in terms of the stance, I think that if somebody is at the end of their level 4 or degree training, we know it's not taught to any great depth in trainings. I'm sure there are some courses that cover it, but our research would say that about 93% of those who attend a practice-based counselling course to become counsellors don't have any meaningful training on trauma. So I think if you are at the end of your training, or maybe you're in placement, I think it's really useful to be able to access this information, because trauma is being seen more and more in student placements. Used to be that you didn't see very much because there was triage. The practice manager would triage people and put the people with traumatic experiences to a more experienced therapist. What we're understanding now is that trauma isn't about war or very serious threats to life. It can be about everyday experiences where someone feels threatened and they just can't get that out of their head.
Number of things you can do. Number one, counsellingtutor.com/live. That's going to give you access to the live lecture delivered by Rory. Trauma, what a counselling student needs to know. It's comprehensive. There are handouts with that. There's additional reference material. You get hours of additional reference material from that lecture as well that are available to you. It's really, really worth going and having a look at that. That's counsellingtutor.com/live, LIVE. Secondly, if you are thinking that you're listening to this and you want to do a certificate in trauma-informed practice, go to counsellingtutor.com. Our courses are right there. You will find our courses, and just go to the trauma-informed practice course. We have two different ways you can do that course. One way is self-directed. You do it in your own time. You access all of the learning materials and you work through what you need to work through in the time that suits you. We have a higher level of that, which is only open to qualified therapists, which is tutor-led, and there's 3 live sessions where you get access to all of the learning materials, but then those learning materials are brought to life and demonstrated and discussed amongst peers and with your tutors, and at a little bit more depth in live sessions. There's obviously a price difference, because if you're going through a more supported journey, there is the tutors there as well, but you can decide what is right for you. But if you are a student and wanting to do that, then the option for you is the self-directed. When you graduate, then you could look at maybe doing the tutor-led and slightly deeper version of that training. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com. Wow, what an episode. This has been Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 309.
Yes, and we started off with ethical, sustainable practice. We talked about online trauma therapy and the reasons that if you work online, you should get yourself some effective training to be able to understand the many psychological and very practical safety orientated aspects of an online practice. In Practice Matters, we spoke to Amy Peters about exploring neurodivergence creatively, honouring a rising group of people who need support and are becoming, I guess, more visible in the world. And then finally, in student services, we talked about vicarious trauma, something sadly that's ever present in our lives, I think, and also especially within training. And we kind of looked at it and talked about areas that we have to be thoughtful of and some practical things that we can do should we come across someone who is vicariously traumatized. Bit of a favor from you. We always enjoy making a podcast, but if you could do us a favor, if you could share your podcast on your social media so that other people can hear what we have to say, and maybe we will help them. And also, if you've liked what you've heard, and I hope you have today, why not give us a review on your favorite podcast platform? We love a bit of a 5-star review, me and Ken, and we enjoy that we've offered that service and given information and helped others. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.